Hello, and welcome to the Heart of Dentistry podcast. We're looking forward to bringing you the tools that will be so helpful in making your career full of heart and fulfillment.
I'm really excited about our guest we have on today. This is Dr. Gregory Toback. He owns multiple practices out in the Connecticut area. And I worked with Dr. Toback several years ago. Well, it was pre-COVID. It was post-COVID, because that was one of the very first trainings that I'd done post-COVID was with you and your practices. So we had to have separate rooms and all this crazy stuff. But welcome, Dr. Toback, and thank you for joining Brandi and I on the Heart of Dentistry podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to see where this conversation leads us.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I was really excited, we started talking back in June. I wanted to get you on sometime, but with all three of us and having busy schedules. But one of the main reasons I wanted you on is because as a coach, I have worked with several DSOs. But when I worked with you at Resolute Dental, it was such a different experience for me as the coach than any other DSO I've ever worked with. In fact, there's all this stuff going around about whether or not we call, if DSO is a 4-letter word, if it's offensive, what a 3-letter word, I guess. To kind of bring us through a little bit of the journey and where your philosophy, what makes you stand, in my opinion, as a coach of 15 years, what makes you stand apart from the rest of the DSO world, would you say?
It's a great question regarding the DSO terminology. It's actually a 3-letter word, but may be offensive to many nonetheless. But it's interesting you asked me that, because we've been really exploring that ourselves over the past year. Is like, what are we and who are we? And we've finally come to the conclusion that we're actually not a DSO, and not because it's offensive or there's anything wrong with being a DSO. It's just not consistent with our vision and our model, nor our strategy. But it took us a while to come to that conclusion. And I guess we'd have to kind of roll the film back a bit on how we got started with Resolute to understand why. And I'm a periodontist by training and trade, and I had my own periodontal practice since 1998. And by 2018, I had seen these amazing legacy practices in our local community have trouble transitioning their practices in the final chapter of the veteran doctor's career, and end up selling their practice to national DSOs, which I'll define in for the sake of this conversation as geographically distant, non-dentist ownership, typically private equity ownership of the practices. And overwhelmingly, I saw a transformation of these practices from what they previously were under the guidance and leadership of the original doctors, founding doctors or owner doctors, to something different, and not always in the most favorable sense in terms of what it meant to the new dentists that took over the reins. Typically, we saw revolving door transitions of these practices. We saw team members, longtime team members, who left those practices frustrated on so many levels with new changing environments. And then ultimately, I think the final litmus test for me as a periodontist in the community, and Brandi, we were talking about this just prior to the call, was the standard of care, the declining standard of care that I had experienced in these collaborative working relationships prior to the sale of the practice, and then what transpired afterwards. And I started asking the questions like, why is this happening? And I saw the potential for a dramatic shift in the quality of care in our local communities, which I care deeply about. And so in 2018, I launched Resolute Dental Partners as a new solution for transitioning practices in our geographic area. And our number one referral practice was an amazing 2-doctor practice, a prosthodontist and a restorative doc. And I purchased their practice when it was in the 9th hour. They were left with a decision to sell it to one of 3 bidding DSOs, and I offered to purchase it. And that's really how Resolute got started. Had no idea where I was going with it. I wanted to save the future of this practice. And that was 6 years ago. And I've learned so much in that time frame. Over the years, we now have acquired 10 locations, consolidated down to 7. 3 are perio, 4 restorative. We've got periodontists, we've got a prosthodontist, and we have general practitioners. And we've really created what we call a family of practices that is doctor-owned. In answering your question, what I witnessed was there was a differential between a dentist-owned, doctor-led practice versus a non-dentist, geographically distant ownership. And when you uncouple those two, unintended things happen that are very, very difficult to fight. And so I thought in the beginning that, like, okay, I'm a dentist, I understand dentistry. But as soon as we acquired our first practice, I realized there was also another ingredient. And it took me a couple of years to come to this conclusion. It was another ingredient that I never saw coming, that was not measurable at first. And that was, even though I was a dentist and I owned that practice, I didn't practice in that practice. And the minute that you own a practice that you are not operating in as a dentist leader, it changes completely the ability to influence the local culture, the team, the standard of care, and everything. So we've really become to this new model where we are a family of practices that is dentist owned, meaning that we want a leader in each practice, a lead doctor who is a partner with us, who owns equity, true equity in that practice, that they take a financial position, that the vision and strategy of that practice is theirs, and that we support them in being able to achieve that. And we feel like that's the ingredient. Like, why do team members love to work for those classic dentists so much? Why? Because there's something special about that relationship when the owner is on site making the decisions for the team, for the patients, and so forth.
I love that model and that thought process, because I've always thought of, like with the DSO world that I've been involved in with consulting, the associates come and go. And I've always thought to myself, it's because they don't have skin in the game and they're looking for a place that they can find as their possible forever home or potential skin and buy-in. And so I think that's brilliant. I don't know why more don't do that, because I think you're right. It's like, well, Dr. Toback didn't say this and you're just an associate. I'm not saying that's what they say, but, you have a long-standing relationship, well, at least when I was working with you, with these doctors. Some of them stayed on, right? That you acquired the practice. Some of them stayed on.
All of them. Fortunately, we've now retired 6 of our doctors successfully in the timelines and visions that they had for themselves, whether it be 3 to 5 years or so, that they continued to work after we acquired them. We would then go and recruit a new lead doctor, a doctor who wanted to have the reins of their own practice and be able to take an ownership position, and now is driving vision and the strategy of their own practice. And there's a difference. You mentioned like DSOs, and there's a very fundamental difference between being a partner in an organization where you're not a true equity partner, where you are maybe a partner in title. There's a lot of models for like profits interest and things like that, phantom ownership, where really there's no control rights, there's no decision-making rights, and a lot of the DSOs, they have a build-to-sell model. So these partnership models are basically golden handcuff type devices to lock in clinicians long enough so that they can have an arbitrage event, ultimately sell the entire organization for a higher multiple, and the partner doctors will be drug along in that sale, and, have a different future than maybe the one that they understood previously. In our model, we're not a build to sell, we're a build to operate, build to support, build to grow organization, where we have no strategy to sell the organization as a whole. Our vision is to create a model where we could recruit, cultivate, develop, and engage new partners, and they would have a vibrant career, at which time there would be a very defined process of which they would then pass the torch by recruiting, onboarding, developing the next future leader. And this, hypothetically could go on generation after generation. So I always said that I wanted to preserve the values of the past generations of dentists and the way they operated in that way, but bring it into a model that we could operate as a family of practices, and we could share resources and best practices, and we could compete in this new market economically with technology and all these things. We can accelerate that timeline, because we all know, like, to own one's own practice, it's risky. It takes a lot of capital, huge debt burden, and by the time you've worked through all of those stressors, it could take decades to really come to the other side of that, where one comes into their own. What we're trying to do is say, hey, through partnership and through the best practices and the resources that we have, we can accelerate that together as a family.
Yeah, and not to mention their possible a dental school debt. Like you've been around for a little while. I've been around for a little while. And when I went to dental hygiene school, it's nothing compared to what, you went to dental school. I mean, it's just crazy. So I love that model. Brandi, did you have something you wanted to add to that? You guys are looking for an associate right now too, or something, aren't you?
We actually hired an associate, and he has been absolutely fantastic. But Greg, I really appreciate what you're saying about this vision, because as a practice owner here in Pocatello, Idaho, the offers from the traditional geographically distant non-dentist owned DSOs are really, really shiny, and they look pretty, and you peel back a layer and they still look pretty, and you peel back a layer and they still look pretty, and you get peeling back that next layer and you start to realize the totality of what you would be getting yourself into. And so I think a model like this is going to be really hopeful for our owners across the nation, because especially like small practice owners that haven't been bought up yet, but are looking towards that retirement stage, that end stage where you still want to run your practice, you still want to be a part of all of the things, but you definitely want to be training and passing that torch, leaving the legacy. So I really appreciate what you are doing, because I think that it's bigger than just your towns in Connecticut. I think that this is a model that could be repeatable and really bless not only the dental owners, but their teams, so we can keep those long-term employees intact. Because even if you don't own the practice, if you've been a hygienist or an assistant or an administrative team member for 20 years, you've got some real investment in the people and the practice that is serving those people that come to see you. So I would really, my hope as I'm listening to you is, are you writing this down? Are you making a model? Like, what is the documentation side of all this looking like? Because I think you're onto something really powerful.
Love it, Brandi. And yeah, I mean, that's really our big lift right now, is having absolute clarity on what our market differentiator is. Because if you're trying to compare yourself or the opportunity that you're offering a dentist or a team member to a DSO, then you've already lost the conversation, because it's apples and oranges.
Yeah.
And so more clarity that you have in what makes you unique, what makes us unique, what are the alignments? Like, what is the desire of the individual that you're talking to? What are they hoping for in their career? What does a successful career look like for them? And it may not be, like, again, there's no judgment here. There's plenty of individuals out there that may align with a national DSO, and plenty of them do. But if they are looking for something unique and different, and they have clarity in their own mind of what they're looking for, then all of a sudden that becomes a very meaningful dialogue where you can find the alignment in what we're constructing and offering, and partnering with certain docs.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that one of the things that I felt very strongly about with working with you and your, I think at the time there was 4 practices you had. I can't remember, but anyways, 3 or 4. So you've really grown exponentially since then. But what I liked is I felt like there was continuity as a Resolute, but then I felt like each office got to feel like they weren't, it wasn't a cookie cutter approach, that they were still an individual office with their special patients and their people that worked there. I really felt as I went into each office to observe and to work with them individually before we brought us all together, that there was definitely still some uniqueness that was allowed in each of those offices.
Absolutely. And we, again, this concept of a family of doctor-owned practices, the practice itself might represent the nuclear family, which has its own, personality. It has its own values unique to them. They have their own vision, but they still belong to the larger family as a whole. That generationally has certain common fundamental values across the larger family. And part of that is we create the support system, we create the guardrails, and then within there is tremendous independence and autonomy to explore the own interests and goals of each individual practice. So you're right that each of our practices has, and we've gotten much more clear about that. In 2018, didn't totally understand that. We kind of set off in a way that a lot of, I think, developing DSOs might, in that we were trying to have things be so uniform. We were trying to build such standards across the board that we started to realize that, there became almost an undercurrent of friction of the us versus them. And I started to realize that as I studied the concept of tribe, that the individual practices had their own tribe. And as long as I was outside of their practice, it was hard for me to be the ultimate influencer. That there was going to be leaders within their own nuclear family, whether, I acknowledged it or not. So we totally turned this on its head, our model, and we said, okay, actually our highest priority is identifying the future leader. And we've gotten way more clear on how we transition doctors. So our last acquisition was just this past July 1, a wonderful restorative practice in Rhode Island, and that I've known and worked with for 26 years. But now more than ever, we've got this very specific timeline where we say, okay, great. You're the leader of your practice. So just because you sell the practice to Resolute Dental Partners, actually you are still the leader. And actually the model of the sale is such that it ties the selling doctor into the future opportunity through this transition. So again, building those alignments. So they are very much still the leader. As a matter of fact, tonight we've got a meeting with the doctors from that practice, the selling doctors from that practice, to revisit our timeline, of which we'll be looking to do a minor renovation to build out 2 more operatories, and then to figure out the timeline for recruiting the next doctor, of which they'll be involved with, recruiting that doctor and then onboarding and developing that doctor, and then over a 5-year plan, handing that torch to that next doctor leader. So making sure that we've actually got a defined strategy for every practice, and we're not just leaving it up for like, yeah, we'll figure it out in the future. It ties us all together with a common vision.
I love it.
And so what has been the hardest part of this? I mean, I would guess, like, let's say aside from deciding that you needed the clarity, like where's the struggle in this model for you?
Wow. Yeah. So what day are we talking about? Today's Tuesday. And Brandi, actually, we were talking before the call about like finding things that stimulate us and cause us to grow and engage us. And as much as I love like recreational things and things outside, it's actually This has been the hardest thing I've ever done in my career, with hands down. It was not easy. I think I had the misconception. Some people will always, talk about how entrepreneurs are delusional. Definitely, I will take the delusional part.
We'll take it. Yeah.
They're like, oh, I know how to do
The
this.
shoe
Like,
fits.
well, if I'm good at this, I'll be good at that, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so you jump in, and the next thing you find out is like, holy cow, this is completely different than anything I've ever done in my life. And definitely has been the most challenging and the biggest lift. And probably for me, one of many things that I've had to learn is the finance of running a large organization. Totally different. Like, I was a very successful practice owner periodontist. And, based off of that, I said, oh, I'm really financially wise. I've got a lot of wisdom that I can impart into a scaling company. And I learned quickly that, no, actually what I really was a very productive. I was a super producer clinician that created a lot of cash flow and created a lot of opportunity. But as, again, I extracted myself from being the one. Now I'm still a practicing periodontist. I still see patients 3 days a week. But as I'm not doing the dentistry and these other practices, figuring out how to understand the finance, one of the best decisions of my life was I hired a world-class CFO about 3 years ago, who is really an integral part of our journey here in educating me on every decision that I make and the financial consequence of that. And I made a lot of decisions, the way I had for 26 years. I made decisions based on my gut, based on being a periodontist, like, oh, I want to renovate this. Let's just go renovate it. I want to buy this equipment and take on this technology. Let's just go do it. And you do that at scale, and you figure out, like, that doesn't really work too well. And then you want to partner up your doctors that you're cultivating and grooming, and the financial consequences of some of those decisions. So really, it's been about understanding finance, how to scale this, how to create financial alignment with our teams that are operating every day, with our partners that we're growing practices with, and figuring out a model that could be sustained over time. And let's not leave out the P word, one that's profitable. Because if business is not profitable, there is no business. So how to do this in a way that's not, let's say, trying to monetize for the sake of a big windfall event. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to build this to operate, which means that there has to be a reasonable amount of profitability in the bones of this business. And so that's been my biggest lesson along the way. And I'm still on it.
That transitions into a question. I was just at the dental festival in Key West, and what I spoke on was of course, you'd have to be hiding under a rock if you didn't know that the cost of salaries and paying our hygienists, our team members, because of supply and demand, let's just face it. How much has that affected you by purchasing these practices and looking at their EBITDA?
Yeah. By the way, I'll look forward to my invitation to Key West next year. That sounds like a fun meeting.
Yeah, it was a really rough 3 days, let me tell you.
Without a doubt. Number one, there's a difference again, right? Like, so there's a difference between how a practice is acquired, which will speak to what the motivations are of the seller. And so we had to get very clear on what are the practices that we're looking to partner with in these transitions, because if a dentist, and they all haven't been bad decisions, we made plenty of good decisions along the way. And early on, I knew that we could not compete with private equity backed DSOs, right? So you got to figure those types of organizations have a lot of cash today that they need to deploy, with the goal of spinning that for profit through a transition 3 to 5 years down the road. That's the way those companies operate. And so a dentist that is looking to, let's say, sell their practice for the largest ticket price, like I want the most amount of money for my practice, we're not going to compete in that arena because we're not looking to roll ourselves up and sell it for an arbitrage event, right? Like, so we had to get very clear, like if you're looking for the most amount of cash for your practice, then that's going to look differently than a transition with us that we're a built to operate company. And so the dentists that we attract are dentists that really take a lot of pride in the legacy that they built, that want to transition their practice to a young practitioner, but they don't know how. They don't want to take on the risk, because how many of those veteran docs, a lot of these baby boomer docs, have tried, right? They took on an associate. They thought they were going to sell it to the associate just for the associate to leave another position. They do that 2 or 3 times. They feel desperate, and they don't know what to do. So docs who really want a legacy preservation, who trust us with their legacy, and yet want a fair price for their practice. And so we create sale models that, again, create alignments like, hey, help us with the recruitment and the transition and support of this new doctor leader, and there will be plenty of upside for you in doing that together with us. So it ties us together in that vision and that strategy.
Oh, that's great. I love that. I think that the listeners are really going to gravitate, because, this is for any dental people out there. We try to look at some of the heart, the ache that's in there, as our title says, and putting the heart back in. And I do know that there is a lot of, not hysteria, but some concern about that there's no more mon pa. There's not going to be, pretty soon, there's not going to be any mon pa, offices, bread and butter, or whatever you want to call them. And I think that just that last 2 minutes of what you just said, I think will bring a lot of relief and a lot of, respect. And I think that if people want to get a hold of you and ask you how you're going about it, from maybe they're in Idaho and they want to know how you're going about it, I'm sure they can get a hold of you somehow, some way. You'd be happy to help them in a certain direction, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I want to actually say that as we started to work through that process, we realized that actually our target, where we started from, was transitioning veteran doctors, but really who we now are speaking to are mid-career doctors who've been grinding it out for 15 years plus and really know, like, their capabilities. They've gotten to a point where they've got certain skill sets honed clinically and leadership-wise. They want to take their practice to the next level. They just need the support on how to get there. And so those are really the doctors that we're talking to now, are those mid-career doctors who are like, I've gotten my practice here, but I see this bigger vision, and imagine if I can get there for the next chapter of my career.
Yeah.
And so those are really the docs that we're super excited about partnering with as well. Again, we're a growth organization, and whatever we touch, we grow it. And so if someone has that vision, like that's our target market.
We love it. Love it. Brandi, is there any other questions you have? I think we got a lot of food for thought, and you can see why I was so excited to get Dr. Toback on and be one of our guests, because, this whole DSO world out there seems to get people a little sideways, a little crazy and fearful. I don't think there's a reason for anyone to be fearful about it, and I think you can hold your head high if you do choose to transition into a model that, like Dr. Toback and Resolute is doing. I think that's the takeaway here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Toback, you are a wealth of knowledge, and I would just like to, I'm sure, speak for everyone listening today. Like, I can't wait to hear more from you. So my questions aren't over, and though our discussion for today is, we'll see you back.
Thanks, Dr. Toback.
Thank you for having me.